Luis asks, when would you say is that it's time to upgrade from the Sony ZV-E10 to the Sony ZV-E1? I don't believe that the ZV-E1 is appropriately considered an upgrade from the ZV-E10, and I'll explain why. So, part of it has to do with, I guess, my understanding of how Sony has positioned various cameras within their lineup for the products that that they have for us to purchase. So you'll notice that within Sony you have the Alpha line, which is Sony like A7 III, A7 IV, A7C, A6700, A6600, basically model names that are followed by a Alpha, right? These are generally cameras that are geared towards people who, or rather the cameras are designed and geared towards taking photos first that can also do videos relatively well. Then you have the ZV line. Now we have Sony ZV-1, Sony ZV-1 Mark II, Sony ZV-1F, which nobody talks about. You have the Sony ZV-E10. You have the Sony ZV-E1. The way that they've positioned this, and you'll notice that these are cameras that are essentially on the opposite side of the spectrum of the Alpha line. And the reason for this is because, and it's in its name, right? The way that Sony's marketing has described it is that you have Sony, Z as in Gen Z, E as an interchangeable mount, V for video centric or vlogging, and then the Sony ZV-E, and then that's what it is. So you have Sony Z for Gen Z, V for video centric, E for interchangeable E mount lens, and then you have the appropriate number. Now Sony ZV-1, ZV-1 Mark II, ZV-1F, they don't have an E on it because it's not interchangeable lens. It's a fixed lens, fixed zoom lens or a fixed prime on the ZV-1F. And so for that reason, and similarly in the ZV-1 line, you also have the RX100 cameras, for example, or the RX10. These are fixed lens cameras, but the RX line is for photos, whereas the ZV line is for Gen Z video-centric focused people. And then you have the ZV-E10 and ZV-E1. They're all in the same category, video first, presumably, but with the focus on content creation, vlogging, and video. But then what it is not typically designed for is a professional type of setting, such as that I would consider long form content, and that has to do with the way it's designed and engineered with relation to reliability. And for that, Sony has a series of FX line cameras. So you have like the FX3, FX30, FX6, FX9, and so on. And then beyond that, you have cinema grade, which has to do with like the Venice, Venice 2, Burano, and things like that. So the naming and positioning of each of these products it's in its own class. And so to consider that you're going from, say, a Sony ZV-1 to a ZV-E10 to a ZV-E1, I don't consider them upgrades because all three of these cameras, for example, are in the same category. To transition from one camera to the next, you're essentially transitioning from one use case to the next. And the best way to put it is a Sony ZV-1, the fixed lens one that has a standard zoom of something like 24 to 70 millimeters approximately in a full frame equivalence. Like the Sony ZV-E1 is essentially the size of this, which is the original EOS M, right? It's got a flip screen, or rather flip articulates outwards as opposed to up. And that's about this size, right? It fits in the palm of your hand, and it's got a fixed lens on it. This one is obviously interchangeable lens, EOS M from Canon, but size-wise is about that. You can throw that in your back pocket, your jacket pocket, and you're good to go. So that's it in its own category. On the other hand, you have the interchangeable lens mount. The moment you're able to put a lens on the camera, you have now moved into a whole different category. Size is no longer, or rather in comparison to like the Sony ZV-1, ZV-1 Mark II, and ZV-1F, you can no longer just take that and go. Now it's become a little bit more substantial in terms of what you can do with it. You can do a lot more with it. But one of the things that you may or may not be able to do with it is depending on, for example, the Sony ZV-E10, because of its size, I couldn't typically do this with like the Alpha series cameras, like the A7, maybe the A7C, but I basically built out a 3-camera rig here, right? This is not a Canon lens. This is the Sony 28mm f2. It's a full frame lens mounted on an APS-C sensor camera, and that gives me about 40 millimeters approximately. Then I have another Sony ZV-E10 with an 85mm mounted with a focal reducer, giving me close to 90mm field of view. And then here I have an Insta360 with a diopter, a +1 diopter, so I can get better close focusing. And this gives me, in 5K, 1-inch sensor, gives me about 17mm field of view after I've stabilized. And so this here is my handheld 3-camera rig that covers everything essentially. And sometimes I might even mount my Insta360 right up here to get some additional wonky 360 spherical type footage that if I want to pair. Now this is my event B-roll rig. That's a very specific use case. It's a very specific build out. Got a little 50 watt-hour battery from Small Rig that I've mounted on here, and this is essentially designed for something specific. I would not be able to do that more or less with most full-frame cameras. For example, this here is Canon 5D Mark III. Significant just by itself. Now this is, I guess, a makeshift top handle that I've also set up with a gimbal, and what I would do is I would mount the same Insta360 that's on there, so I get 2 angles, and this here is for the Insta360 Go 3 that I would just put on there to capture gyro data to stabilize this. But like this is still 1, maybe 2 cameras if I don't have typically just a top mount, right? 1 camera versus 3 cameras, right? So that's one thing to think about. The other thing is that with the Sony ZV-E10, we're talking about a different sensor. It's a crop sensor. It's an APS-C sensor, which is different from a Sony ZV-E1. And so as a result, you're going to get different fields of views. You're going to have different options with relation to lenses. So for me, like, a full frame will never be as compact as an APS-C sensor or APS-C setup. So for example, if I really wanted to maintain something, maintain a smaller size, I can just take one of these cameras out from here. I could put a 20mm pancake lens on there, which is designed for APS-C sensors. I think it's Sony's smallest pancake lens compared to a full frame, which is a 35mm f2.8, which is their smallest full frame lens. It's still going to be like 2 or 3 times bigger than the 20mm. So right there, there's a trade-off. Bigger sensor, bigger size, bigger lenses, essentially, even if the body is approximately the same size. So it's not necessarily an upgrade unless you are moving to something specific that you, due to the use case, that you're lacking with the ZV-E10 that you just simply are not getting, and therefore would benefit from the ZV-E1. But that movement from going from a Sony ZV-1, for example, that camera lens combo, I mean, because it's an attached lens by itself, would probably cost you maybe $600-700, and you're done. get a battery with it. Maybe you want to buy an additional battery. That might be another $30. You're done, right? SD card, if you don't have one, that's another $30. Okay, great. You're still maybe $600, $700, $750 at most with taxes and everything like that. If you get a ZV-E10, $700 just for the body alone. Maybe if you get something used, maybe $600. But then you got to get a lens. That's another $200, right? Already, you're significantly more with relation to budget between those two cameras. Now, you jump onto the ZV-E1, it's $2,000. Now, maybe you hunt around and look for something used, you might pay close to $1,500. More typically between $1,500 and $1,800 for the ZV-E1. That is already more than double the price. So for the price of two of these, right, I'm getting one ZV-E1. Is that an upgrade? I don't know, right? I can do a lot more with two Sony ZV-E10s than with just one Sony ZV-E1. So it's a question of what are you upgrading to? Because there is an obvious budget difference between the two cameras. On top of that, the lenses for full frame on Sony E-mount are going to be significantly more in comparison to the APS-C lenses too, with relation to cost. So again, what are you upgrading to? And so for my use case, and I can't speak for you or speak to your use case necessarily because I don't know, I'm not as aware, but I know for my use case, the thing that the ZV-E1 would perform well in, that the ZV-E10 would not perform well in, is the dynamic situation, run and gun, out and about, travel, vlogging, perhaps action, jiu-jitsu, just general day in the life, that kind of stuff where I'm not in a controlled environment. The area that the ZV-E1 really shines has to do with its low light capability, right? It can go up to 400,000 ISO, that's one. And the second is its sensor readout speed. It's got a very fast, the fastest, if I'm not mistaken, within the scope of Sony, excluding the new Sony A9 Mark III, which is a global shutter sensor, meaning there's essentially a 0 millisecond readout in comparison to other cameras, right? With the Sony ZV-E1, FX3, A7S3, all three of these cameras are using the same sensor, and you have about just over 8 millisecond readout speed. What that means is when you're dynamically, moving about and around with the camera, whip panning, running around, following somebody, chasing someone, the ZV-E1, the FX3, and the A7S3, all three of these cameras will perform really well in that situation, in the sense that even if you do digital stabilization within the camera, you're not going to see a lot of jelloing. Whereas with these guys, you must mind your movement because of the fact that these have some really slow, relatively speaking, slow sensor readout speed. Although technically the sensor readout speed is something along the lines of like 27 or 26 milliseconds. In order for me to correct the rolling shutter that comes out of this in a dynamic situation, and that's why I tend to avoid using these in fast-paced, uncontrolled environments, then I will overcorrect the rolling shutter in something like Catalyst Browse. Not Catalyst Browse. Catalyst Browse will correct rolling shutter, but it won't give you the option to change how much the rolling shutter is going to correct. And so for that reason, I thought I was out of focus for a second there. I think I was out of focus. But anyway, for that reason, what was I saying? Yeah, because the rolling shutter is so bad on this, I will go into gyro flow specifically, and I will overcorrect. I will overcorrect to maybe 40 milliseconds just to regain some of that warpy jello effect. Now, it does a pretty good job, but from my perspective, that would be unnecessary with the ZV-E1. So I would almost exclusively use the Sony ZV-E1 for all my dynamic settings. Now, what are the situations in which the Sony ZV-E10 would outperform and would be a better option than the Sony ZV-E1? Well, one among them would be my ability to get reach, right? So in the sense of, because it's the crop sensor camera, I'll be getting a narrower field of view. And so as a result, if I want to, especially in an event setting, I would prefer these, and ideally even better an FX30. In fact, an FX30 would be a proper upgrade to the ZV-E10 because the FX30s got more things that enable it to do the job better in the very things that these, in my perspective, are geared towards. So the FX30 has one better sensor readout speed than these, twice as fast, I think 15 milliseconds, not as fast as the ZV-E1 or the FX3. And on top of that, it has a fan built into it. So you don't have to worry about any kind of overheating. Now, these guys, they don't overheat on me, but I do have to set the temperature setting to high. And so as long as the temperature setting is set to high, I don't have an issue. But even with the temperature setting being set at high, if I'm outdoors, these guys will overheat, no question, especially in Texas heat, summer, Houston, without a doubt. I will avoid, to the best of my ability, to take these outside. I will use them in a controlled, air-conditioned environment indoors. However, with an FX30, I would not have that issue. I could take that outside, even in a long-form type of content. Among them could be lectures, events, weddings, things like that. Now, right now, whenever I've done a few weddings, I will either use my GH5 or I will rent a camera. And one of the cameras that I've rented in the past for weddings, for example, that's done really well is the Canon M6 Mark II. But I chose not to buy that camera. I figured it's a good camera to rent for a very specific thing. There are certain downfalls for it that would prevent me from wanting to keep that camera, but that's a discussion. I've actually done a video on that. You can check it out on that channel here. But with relation to the ZV-E10, the other thing is, now indoors, I've recorded with this for hours upon hours, days upon days. We're talking about, anywhere between 4 to 8 hours a day of continuous recording on this, and for several days at a time. And I have not had a problem, have not had it overheat. It's been warm without a doubt, but I haven't had it overheat. The FX30 would be an upgrade because I'll get dual card slots. I used to have dual card slots on my XD cams, which I had prior to this, but the XD cams are significantly bigger, smaller sensor, so the dynamic situation would not work out for me. That's why I kind of sort of downgraded from an XD cam, which are pure video cameras, to a ZV-E10, which have a larger sensor than the 1-inch sensor, but are smaller, more versatile, allow for interchangeable lenses and things like that. And so I got a lot more mileage for what I was looking to do. But one of the things I absolutely miss that I didn't have in, that I don't have in the ZV-10 is definitely having those dual card slots. And so that allows for either redundant recording between the two or continuous recording. So if one card runs out, then it'll automatically start recording on the next card. And so especially when I'm recording something like a seminar where we have 30, 40, 60 hours of content over the course of several days, as one card runs out, I can just pop it out, start to transfer, begin organizing while the other card is already in, and another card clears up. I can just go ahead and put that in so that when the second card fills up, it'll go now back to slot 1 and continue the recording. I can do that with my GH5. I was able to do that with my XD cams. I believe you can do that on the FX30 and the FX3. You cannot do that on the ZV-E10 nor on the ZV-E1 because both of those cameras have only one card slot. And so as a result, you're gonna have to swap out. The other thing I don't like about the ZV-E10 is that the insert for the card slot is from the bottom, right? As opposed to from the side. I honestly don't understand why. Like, for example, right, on this here, every camera should have side insert for cards. 5D Mark III has it, GH5 has it, M6 Mark II has it, FX3 and 30 has it. Why not? Why don't they just make that standard? I guess they're trying to make it as small and compact as possible, so they make the insertion of the SD card an inconvenience. And so if you've got like some sort of mounting or something like that underneath and it blocks it, then you're going to run into an issue. Like, for example, here, Like I've got these two cameras right on top of each other. So I've had to design this rig. This is Mark IV, version 4 of this rig. One of the latest additions I had to do was so that I have this NATO clamp in here, and I can just go ahead and put that in. And once that NATO clamp is loose, I can just take the two apart. So that way, if I need to either change the battery or change the SD card, I can do that. And once I've done that, I slide this right back in. And then I can close that and tighten that back up, and we're good to go. And so I've had to make that modification. However, if this thing did not have that issue, and I had the SD card insertion on the side or something like that, I could just pop open the door on the side and we'd be good to go. But that is not the reality. That's one of the things I dislike about the ZV-E10. I do not remember when I rented the ZV-E1. I had it for about a month. I do not remember if the SD card insertion was from the side or if it was from the bottom. And so I cannot comment on that right now. But yeah, the other thing is also long form recording. Now the ZV-E1 could potentially work out as a long form recording solution, but there's some considerations that you would have to make. Among them is with relation to thermal management. If you want to be able to dissipate the heat appropriately, having a cage on there helps, because now you have some sort of thing that's going to absorb the heat and dissipate it. Metal does a really good job of that, so having a metal small rig cage around the ZV-E1 helps. On top of that, I think Ulanzi or whatever, they make a fan, and I got one of those fans. Now, without the fan, I was able to successfully, within an air-conditioned environment, record close to 40 minutes. And the only reason I didn't continue further is because my battery ran out, because I hadn't fully charged it before that recording. We went out to a trampoline park, and I just recorded continuously. I just wanted to see how long I would go. I didn't think that it would last that long, because a lot of different people reported the camera overheating after about 30 minutes or so. And I knew I had just over 30 minutes of battery time. I actually had close to 40 minutes. And it continued recording for 40 minutes with no overheating indicator showing up. So I did set the thermal setting to high, but with relation to whether or not it was something that would be an issue, I don't know, because my battery ran out. Now, other people have said that adding the fan on there definitely helps, and they've been able to live stream and record for 2-3 hours at a time. I don't know of anybody who has attempted to do it longer than that, but it might be something that I will do for a future seminar, just to test out. But in almost every case, whenever I do seminars, if I do need an additional camera, if I'm going to rent something, I'm just going to rent an FX3. And that's what I have done. I either rented one or I brought somebody along who had one. And so in that case, like from a ZV-E1, an FX3 is an appropriate upgrade. From a ZV-E10, FX30 or an FX3 is an appropriate upgrade, because it is enabling me to do more of what it is intended and designed to do, but within the same category. So you have the ZV-1, ZV-E10, ZV-E1. All three of these cameras are in the same category, but they're designed for different things. One's designed for portability and pocketability. The other is designed for just content creation in a controlled setting. At least that's where it shines. And the third is designed for content creation in a dynamic setting. And that's where these three cameras kind of line up. And there's also a clear differentiation in price from like $700 to $1,000, maybe $1,500 max, if you're trying to buy everything that goes with the ZV-E10, which includes lenses, power, light, and things like that. And then you have the ZV-E1. Now, at the same time, from my perspective, practicing what I preach, if I have the budget for a single ZV-E1 versus multiple ZV-E10s, without a doubt. I would even consider an FX30 an upgrade to a ZV-E1 for the context of long form recording, and maybe even for dynamic recording. The only situation that you're going to be experiencing a trade-off is low light. You like this, the FX3 sensor, the ZV-E1 and the A7S3, all three of them are the same sensor. The low light in that is absolutely phenomenal. And so it's like you're shooting in the dark. Like you can shoot in the dark and it'll look like it's daytime out. So whereas on the FX30, when you shoot with that, it'll be like a normal thing. It's actually really good, generally speaking, but it's not like shooting in the dark. But if you're using it for a controlled setting, it is more than enough. And so I hope that is helpful. I hope that clarifies what I mean by why I don't believe that the E1 is an upgrade from the E10, is just in its own category. So the upgrade is when you move from the ZV line to an FX line, and notice I mentioned FX specifically and not the Alpha series, because the Alpha series are photocentric cameras, with the exception of the A7C class of cameras, because that is kind of like teetering it's kind of like a bridge between the Alpha photo line and the video line, in the sense that it still has a viewfinder, but it gives you a rangefinder style. So like I love like this style. This is the EOS M6 Mark II. I've modded it a little bit so I can put a Insta360 Go 3 on there, so that way I get gyro data to stabilize this via gyro flow. But like this style, this shape of camera, I really appreciate. And it's the same thing with the Sony ZV-E10, the A7C, E1, FX3, FX30. That rangefinder style, I don't appreciate the viewfinder bump that comes in both the DSLR as well as mirrorless cameras, because as a primary video shooter, an occasional photo person, I don't ever use the viewfinder. It's not me. And so it's a waste of space from my perspective. And so I would much appreciate, I think the the 5D Mark III, like I love the style of the body style and the size of the 5D Mark III. Like this is perfect in my hands. It would be better if they just topped off the viewfinder and they just gave me that. This would be perfect. Another example would be the GH5 or the M6, not the M6, the R6 Mark II. Both of them also similar body, similar like ergonomics. Like you cannot, that's the thing about Canon in comparison to like Sony, that Canon and Panasonic, they've got the ergonomics of how the camera feels in your hand. They've got that down pat. It's just perfect. Like I could hold this all day and not skip a beat. Whereas with Sony, you need to add a cage of some sort to get that additional grip. And so that's just really it. I mean, honestly, if they just had even like the newer APS-C style RF mount cameras from Canon, the R10, the R7, the R6 Mark II, R6, R5, like all of them, they feel excellent in the hand. Even the GH5 and the S1H from Panasonic. I have not held the S5, but I would assume it would be a similar story. They all feel great in the hand. It's just that Sony does not feel good in the hand, except that you add, so like with this cage, with the smaller cage, then it just feels perfect. Like the way that the grip goes around my fingers, but without it, it becomes, it's uncomfortable. And so ergonomically, I think this is where Sony tends to fall short across the board. And so that's just a note for just to kind of keep in mind. M6 Mark II, although the shape of it is not ideal, tactilely they've got this rubber texture, right? Similar rubber texture to the small rig cage that's on the Sony ZV-E10. But just that rubber texture just kind of makes it feel like it's not going to fall from my hands. And so that's just something to consider with relation to when you're trying to pick out the cameras. But yeah, I hope that answers your question. I'm trying to think if I've missed anything with relation to the idea of upgrading. Price, that's going to be your number one factor. Use case, right? Oh, the other thing to also understand, if you're into photos at all. Oh yeah, I was talking about the A7C. Yeah, so the A7C is an excellent photo camera. And one of the things I appreciate about the A7C, and I could see it being something that's of value in the A7C Mark II. When I rented the A7C, I felt that in full frame mode, it was an excellent photo camera. And in crop mode, I thought it was an excellent video camera, because in crop mode, now the full frame video mode, the rolling shutter and the jello effect was very noticeable, to the same degree that it's noticeable on the E10. For dynamic settings, for capturing and recording sports and any of those kind of high energy activities, it was not ideal. But when you put the A7C into crop mode, you get a faster readout speed because you're dealing with less data, and therefore it can process it faster, as I understand it. And so as a result, you don't get as much jello. And so even when you take that crop mode footage, you put it through gyroflow or Catalyst Browse, it ends up being a lot smoother. But it still doesn't compare to the rolling shutter performance, the sensor readout speed of the Sony ZV-E1, FX3, and A7S3. So, but then, you get what you pay for with relation to what it is that you're going to. Today, knowing what I know now, if I were to buy just one camera that I would need to be able to do a lot of things, right? Maybe the A7C would be the first one, Mark I, would be the camera to get, but I would not want to pay more than $1,000 for it used, right? And then from there, what I would do is I would buy a 20mm pancake lens to use for video in crop mode, and I would buy maybe a handful of vintage lenses at less than $50 a pop, like a 50mm 1.8, 100mm maybe, or 135mm 2.8, and maybe some sort of wide angle, like a Tokina 11-16 for perhaps, because 16mm gives me full frame 16mm field of view, or 11mm crop mode will still give me the similar field of view. Like that would be my one camera starter kit for under $1,500. But that's if I were to do one camera. And then I wouldn't stop there, because I would use that as a launching pad, as a launching point to do work, get paid, and then get to a setup that, for me to do more of what brings in the money. So if I'm going to do seminars, I'm going to get multiple cameras, right? I might get an additional 2 A7Cs, use them in crop mode for video, or get a couple of FX30s, and then that way I get the dual card slots and fan and things like that. But again, if you're on a tight budget, these are your options. If you are again, understand your context, understand your use case, and get the appropriate tools for that. So I know this was a bit of a long-winded answer, but I hope it was helpful. Let me know if you have any questions in the comments below. I'll see you soon.